Welcome, everyone, to the May 2021 Bible and Beyond discussions. I'm your host, Shirley Paulson, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Hal Tausig. In this study tonight, we'll be talking about the life of Polycarp's death. The whole subject of martyrdom has been such an important one in the evolution of Christianity. Perhaps the most evocative and garbled martyr stories of the early Christ people are the ones about Polycarp. Tonight, we'll be looking at several different versions of the text of the Martyrdom of Polycarp to see how the stories elaborate themselves and the meanings of his martyrdom. Just a gentle reminder that donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives really are appreciated. $10 per person each month is pretty much what we need to keep us going. You can easily find the donation link on the Early Christian Texts website. You can use PayPal or send a check, or you can use the donation link I've posted into the chat tonight. Thank you so much for your support. So, Hal, it's all yours. Glad you're there.
Thanks so much, Shirley. And I'm glad to be with you all for this text that we'll be studying, or a set of texts. It's a very interesting and complex subject matter for us to study. And just to give us a little bit of a perspective, this Monday night, to the fourth Monday night of every month, we have been looking mainly on what we call the Bible and beyond. And we've been mostly looking at a whole set of texts that have been discovered within the last 150 years. As many of you know, there are more than 125 texts that in the last 150 years have been discovered in mainly in North Africa. And so we've been looking at a lot of those texts that have been really demanding the attention of both the public and scholarship. And today we are not going to be looking at texts that are newly discovered or even vaguely newly discovered, but we're going to be looking at texts that have been around for at least 1,000 years by and large. And that would be mainly versions of a document called the Martyrdom of Polycarp. And so we will look at them mainly because I think it's fairly clear that the figure of Polycarp, who we think lived in the 2nd century, was fairly interesting for a lot of different writers. We are not completely sure of ourselves on some of that. And so one of the main things that's fun about looking at Polycarp is that we have a bunch of very different pictures of him in a bunch of texts that are, some of them are partial, many of them are written at different times. And so even though it looks like the figure of Polycarp was one that got people's attention, at least in the 2nd century, you will find me mostly this evening interested with you in thinking about a fairly strong figure in the 2nd century that seems to just have a fairly large range of what one might think about him and what meanings might be made about him. So let me pretend to be able to tell you then the story of Polycarp. I say it that way because we will be going back over that question during our hour together, because there seem to be a lot of questions about how the pieces of Polycarp fit together. one of the main things, of course, is that he seems to be mostly known for what would be a.
So for me, next Tuesday rather.
I'm going to stop for a moment. I'm getting another voice. Okay, good. All right, so that seems to work. Good. The martyrdom of Polycarp seems to be a major main dimension of how to think about him and what he meant to people in the 2nd century and beyond. Now, before I get into pretending that I can tell that story, let me tell you that probably most of the texts that we have are from the 10th century. 10th and 11th century. This you should be worried about because that's very late, even for ancient texts. Often we'll find texts that have a manuscript from the 10th or 11th century, but usually we can find manuscripts that go back at least to the 5th century, and some even to the 3rd. But we have one of the main things we have to worry about and be fascinated with is that either the manuscripts were lost that are somewhere between the 3rd and the 11th century, or it just became a thing to think about Polycarp so late. Since I'm mainly a person of the study of the first 2 centuries, and because historical guesses are that Polycarp lived in the 2nd century, I'm hoping that we can really at least project that there are some real strong interests of Polycarp in the 2nd century. Now, back to me pretending that I can tell you the story. There's just very small amounts of documents that say that Polycarp was a student of John, meaning the evangelist that wrote the Gospel of John. And so, frankly, scholars don't know quite what to think about whether that is historical or not, but it's the only real thing we have about maybe putting him, Polycarp, even at the end of the 1st century, as a student of John the Evangelist. Then there are smatterings of material about him in which he is a leader of a group of people, probably even some community or maybe even a movement in Asia Minor, and probably in the city of Smyrna. That's, again, I think we have enough little bits about that I would want to encourage you to think that Polycarp is in fact, or was in fact, a person who led a group of Christ people into the 2nd century and through. But the martyrdom of Polycarp says that it occurred in his 80s. That is, that he was killed by Roman rulers when he was in his 80s after an entire career of leading a particular movement in Asia Minor. Now, so the story sort of picks up with Polycarp being a leader of this community or movement, and some leaders in Asia Minor of Roman rule have decided that he is doing something wrong. It's a little bit vague as to what he's doing wrong, but it's what is clear in the story of the martyrdom of Polycarp with its various versions is that it may have to do with Polycarp and his people refusing to make a sacrifice to the emperor as a god. So this is a fairly standard thing that Christ people in the 1st and 2nd century may get in trouble with the Roman rulers for. And in this case, he has been known for not, one could say, probably not making a sacrifice to the emperor forever, and teaching people in his movement not to do that either. So hidden then behind such a controversy for us to really think about this thoroughly, we would have to take several months to do this. But I want to say that it's clear in the 2nd century that it's not just Polycarp that is in trouble for not having making a sacrifice to the Roman emperor. That would, and the background, of course, of this, as some of you will know, the background is that the emperor himself claims to be a god. And that's why the emperor and his rulers say that everyone needs to signify that the emperor is a god by making a sacrifice to him. And that would be in basically any old temple. That is, for that, if you want to honor the emperor as a god, and this happens to most emperors in the 1st and 2nd century, they claim to be a deity, and they claim to be they need to be honored by this people making some kind of sacrifice to him, either in their home or in a temple. That happens probably a lot everywhere. And of course, the other thing to think about is, since Rome has taken over so many different nations who have other gods that they worship, the emperor is in contest with more traditional deities. And in this case, it would be that Polycarp says that he is a follower of Jesus and of Jesus as God. And probably that in some way or another, Jesus himself is divine. I'm not talking exactly clearly there, because we think there may be different versions of Polycarp in that regard. What I want to now say then is that it can be that if you tell other people not to give a sacrifice to the emperor, and you don't over a period of time, that this means that you're a dangerous person to the empire, and therefore deserving of death. I want to say just a little bit outside the story itself now, but to say scholars of the last 25 to 30 years will often talk about martyrdom in the following way, and these are really important scholars who are breaking new ground. It used to be that most scholars would say, yes, in the 2nd century and in the 3rd century, the emperor and his rulers basically killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people that were Christ people. There's a little bit more hesitancy in the last 25 years about whether all of the many stories in the 2nd and 3rd century about the emperor making martyrs of Christ people, or whether they're just more stories and not a lot of actual events like that. So right now, scholars of our day are probably divided to a certain extent, but more and more are saying lots of stories about Christ people dying at the hands of imperial rulers, and maybe not lots of facts about to that end. It's clear that some of them were killed by imperial power, and I would say, by and large, it's probable that Polycarp was, even though they did it when he was over 80 years old. That's a question to keep in mind. Why would you want to kill an 85-year-old person? Looks like he's going to die anyway pretty soon. So the story of Polycarp's death at the hands of Rome is this. And this you'll find me humming and hawing a fair amount. First, he says, oh, they want to kill me? Let them come ahead. I will accept them killing me because I know that the God I worship is the real God, and I deny the fact that the emperor is a god. By the way, parenthetically, at that point, if you think the emperor is a god, you have good reason, because he owns and runs everything. He acts like a god. In fact, in your daily life, you've probably got more reason to think that if anybody is a god, it's him. So Polycarp is saying, no deal. That's not true. Come ahead and kill me, because I stand for the God that has been with me all my life. The second part of the story is, and we don't know whether this is an alternate version of the story or whether this is sequence. But here, the second part of the story is that he gets scared and decides, no, he's not going to stand still for Roman rulers killing him. He's going to run and hide and make sure that they don't kill him. So the next part of the story, and it's a little bit gobbled in its story, and I know some of you've read it in advance for tonight, but the next part of the story is, as he's running away, the soldiers that are chasing him now for the Roman emperor, they find two of his servants, maybe slaves, I would say probably slaves, and the people that are chasing Polycarp get the slaves and say, where is he? In some versions of the story, they torture the slaves until they tell them where Polycarp is. And they go and they find Polycarp with not too much trouble. And in most of the parts of the story, versions of the story, Polycarp is sleeping. So they wake him up and say, we got you. We're taking you in to prepare you for death because you don't offer sacrifices to the emperor. But then there's an intervening part of the story that says that has this. And there's some other stories from other killings or stories of killings that are the same way. That once they have somebody that they intend to kill, they try to talk them out of having to kill them. And all they would have to do would be to say, Caesar is Lord. Because that's what everybody else is saying. Please notice here that the phrase Jesus is Lord is probably secondary to the phrase Caesar is Lord. That is, the idea that the crucified Jesus is Lord of all comes probably as a countervailing way of living and thinking to saying Caesar is Lord of all. So anyway, they say, look, either just make a sacrifice, or it'll even be okay if you say Caesar's Lord, and then we'll just let you go. The next part of the story, and again, you'll notice why many scholars are acting like, are these parts of the story that come right after one another, or are they different versions of the story? The next part is that Polycarp's response to the people who are arresting him is, hey, let's have a meal together and let's talk and enjoy one another. Interesting part of a story, isn't it? Especially given what we studied last month, when we studied about all of the stories of Jesus and Jesus people, who the main way they got together every week was having a long and boisterous and joyful meal together. So I want to hope to get back to this part of the story, but the story here we have yet another version or part of Polycarp's way of dying, is have a meal, a joyful meal with the people that want to kill you. In and of itself, that, frankly, partly because I've studied the meals of the early Christ people so much, but that makes me really interesting in telling a story in which the killers get invited to dinner. Not just a dinner pro forma, but a dinner in which they're singing and laughing and joke telling and the like. Now that's clear, I think, that if this is real, or even if it's just story, that this is a very interesting portrait of someone on his way to being killed by the rulers of the empire. All right, and then the meal's over, and they take him in. And they take him in, and once again, when they bring him to the where they put him in some kind of holding, they again try to say, "Listen, we don't want to kill you. You're old. You're pretty well known here. Could you just say Caesar is Lord?" And we remember now that at least in one part of the story, or one version of the story, Polycarp himself has said, "I don't want them to kill me. I'm going to run away," so that they don't. Now they're saying to him, "We won't kill you. All you have to do is do a little sacrifice, or just say Caesar is Lord." And then he won't say that. He is then taken, and this is again where the stories about him are fairly different. They're basically they threaten to bring him to the arena and have the wild beasts kill him. But most of the stories then say they turn away from that and they decide to burn him, tie him up and burn him to death. And then that happens. So they tie him up and they set him on fire with wood and the like. But the problem here then is in the story that he won't die. And then now we've got several versions of this story that I'll tell you both versions of. So when he doesn't die and he's still being burned, he's still burning and burning and burning, but not dying. They decide to take weapons and stab him to death. And in fact, there are two versions of this part of the story in which they stab him to death and blood flows out from him. So in one version then, he is dead. In the other version, he may be dead, but there's so much blood that flowed out that that it put out the fire. Kind of leaves that up in the air in a couple of the versions there of the manuscripts. But basically, he dies, and then his followers claim that he is taken to God and lives with God forever. There are later stories also of his funeralizing. Involves people taking parts of his bones and claiming his bones as holy. All right, so there's more ifs, ands, or buts in the story, but I think it took me almost 20 some minutes to give this sort of overview of it. I should stop and have you all, first of all, because some of you have read this, I know, in the last week or two, ask questions, because I'm sure you may have found some parts of the story that I didn't include. And some of you will have heard some parts of the story that you didn't read in your version online. There are a bunch of different versions online. So let's stop and hear from you about your general opinion of this set of stories about Polycarp, or questions about it. We'll talk quite a bit about what this might mean. So let's not go there right now. Let's see if I have managed to at least vaguely give you a story that you want to talk about.
Hal, I would just say that Mark has asked a question a while ago. I don't know if this fits in the category of meaning or not, so you can tell if you want to explain it later. But Mark asks in the chat, what features distinguish a sacrifice from a tax, or making sacrifice from paying taxes? Are they different administrators, or what's the difference?
Oh, that's a great question, Mark. No, this fits really very much into what we need to think. As we know, those of us who read Gospels in and outside the Bible, as we know, one of the things that bugs everybody living in the Mediterranean in the 1st and 2nd century is that all of the different nations that have been conquered by Rome is taking massive taxes from everybody, which impoverishes much of the population. Similarly, of course, Rome is also taking tens of thousands of slaves from the nations that they conquered. So Yeah, I would want to say, Mark, that that it looks like not sacrificing to the emperor is worse than not paying taxes. Um, uh, I would want to say that the people who don't pay taxes do get punished in one way or another. Their possessions can get taken away. They can have their money forcibly taken away in one way or another, or they can be thrown in jail. Or sometimes that would get you not brought to the arena or set on fire, but that would get you crucified. Crucified is the punishment for leading or participating in a rebellion against Rome. So I think so. The way the world works in the first and second century is, yes, it's a little less scary to not pay taxes than to not make a sacrifice to the emperor.
Thank you.
Mhm. Other thoughts, questions, protests about this material? Now, question then back to you. How many of you, raise your hand, because I can see some of you online, or even show me you for a moment if you want to. Raise your hand if you've heard about Polycarp. Oh, that's amazing. Those of you who uh, uh, can or can't see, it looks to me like maybe a third of you have. That makes me even happier in a weird sort of way, in that I think this is a fascinating set of stories and gives us a lot to think about in terms of who they are in the second century that are Jesus people or Christ people. Okay, any other thoughts before we go the next round?
You know, Hal, I would really be interested in your saying just a word about why the whole subject of martyrdom became such an important one in Christian history. I mean, for some of us who've never even paid any attention to martyrdom, why was it such a big deal? And why is it still such a big deal?
Thank you, Shirley. Well, let's first say a little bit more about your question, in that certainly in terms of Christian types, we'll have to say that Catholicism has, in our day and in our history, paid more attention to martyrs than Protestants. And so, yes, for instance, most Protestants or other kinds of Christians would be brought up less on stories of people who are killed by Rome in those first 2 to 5 centuries. So why? It seems to me that, and I'm a Protestant and I'm a Christian, Protestant Christians, I don't get why Protestant Christians don't take this seriously, because it's quite clear. There's tons of material about it very early in the second and third centuries. And so I wonder why I was not, I mean, I don't think I learned any martyr stories when I was growing up. I don't think my seminary taught me much about martyrdom. My PhD hardly went that direction either. It and now in the last 30 years, I've been reading all of this material, Polycarp being one of the first of the stories, so I would want to say that it is the larger experience of violence in the first 2 centuries, not just for Christ's people, but by everybody under Rome. There's tons of violence done by the state. And this is a massive set of challenges just to stay in one piece, because there's so much violence by Rome. It tends to be random violence. It doesn't seem to be focused on different religions, but clearly, to a certain extent, Rome is pretty paranoid because it's got so much territory to be in charge of. And so Rome is always worried that there's going to be rebellion in one or another part of the Mediterranean. And so their main way of trying to keep that under control is basically to scare people. And that's often by, for instance, one of the main ways you scare people is slavery. Another way is there are tens and tens of thousands of crucifixions. And those are sometimes because somebody is really threatening Rome with a rebellion, but often it's because the Roman soldiers simply we have this in the Roman records, that the Roman soldiers would simply go into a village and pick out a random person or pick out a random leader and crucify them in the village square. The reason to do that, obviously, is that tells everybody in the public square, I don't want to get caught saying bad things about Rome. I don't want to get caught doing things against Rome. So I want to say, Shirley, that the stories, and of course, it really was true that Rome also had all these amazing arenas where they would punish people to death in front of thousands of people. So I want to say that to a certain extent, it's clear that some Christ people were killed randomly, and some people were killed because they were not doing sacrifice for the emperor. But I think the stories of Christ people being killed by Rome is at least a way of thinking out loud as a group or as a community about the danger of Roman violence that keeps coming at them over and over and over again. So you're asking a question, Shirley.
Are you talking about me?
I just heard. I thought I saw Shirley.
Yeah, I thought you were stopping. I was just going to tell you that Helen had a question before you.
Oh, good, Helen. Yeah.
I think there's also a sacredness about sacrifice that you find in the Christian story. Of course, you've got Jesus being sacrificed and martyred, and then you have Jesus in the Gospel of John saying, "Greater love has no one than to give up your life for a friend." So there was obviously a need within the Christian community to find some kind of meaning in these sacrifices, because that, it would actually make, if I was there, it would make me doubt the benefits of being a Christian. So there had to be something that, would give meaning to that kind of love.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. And I want to put what you just said importantly beside what I just said, because both of us were then asking the question, what stories make sense and help make meaning for the Christ communities and the Christ movements and the like. And I think that is true. One of the questions about sacrifice in the Christ people is that so in later times, the Eucharist or the communion is called a sacrifice. In the first and second centuries, much less so. So certainly not, to a certain extent that does happen, but I would say the idea of communion or the Eucharist as a sacrifice is mostly something that emerges in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. But you and I are right on the same page in that. The question is, how do we understand what life is about? Since there's so many pressures on us, say the Christ people in one or another community. All right. Other thoughts or questions as we go forward? I can see as you all, as we're getting into the material, I can see how this is coming together as the larger Polycarp set of realities. So, for instance, I would want to say to you, Helen, that thing about Polycarp inviting the people that are going to kill him to a joyous meal is a pretty amazing set of drama.
Maybe echoing the Eucharist.
Excuse me?
Maybe echoing the Eucharist that you were.
Yeah, almost certainly. Or maybe being the Eucharist. In other words, maybe what he said, maybe what he did was simply have the regular old Christ people meal, and it included people who were going to kill him. That in and of itself brings right to what you were saying. Blessed are the people who lay down their life for a friend. So putting then these killers in that kind of frame of reference is a striking way of living. And of course, there are plenty of Jesus teachings in which one is asked to be kind or step out and be next to someone who is hurting. Okay, so let's have us then ask a little bit more directly. Why would people tell stories about Polycarp? In other words, what does that bring you? And why do you keep telling different kind of stories that sort of contradict one another? In other words, and I'm wanting to say, and here I would want to say that probably some of these differences come from different communities. I'll tell you this story about Polycarp. I'll tell you this story about Polycarp, and they may not fit. And there may be all of these different versions of Polycarp's being killed because so many people are interested in talking about it. and maybe making additional stuff about it up that make sense in terms of what is happening in your life. So what would you say? What do you think? Why would people talk about this person? And especially about how he died. So you'll notice the cleverness of Shirley's title for this evening, The Life of Polycarp's Death. And that means, of course, all of the different ways in which Polycarp is subject of life's drama, gifts, and challenges. Mark, is that you?
Mute yourself, Mark.
This is Mark. I didn't have an answer to this question, but I had a question about the martyrdom deal.
Mm-hmm.
Might our unfamiliarity with martyrdom come with Protestant background? Like Luther and company flattened the Catholic hierarchy and demoted these elevated believers, the martyrs. So if we were Catholics, we would know the martyrs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think yes, I meant to say that about my background is my Protestantism simply left me out of the loop.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, of course, Protestants really like to think about how their way is different than the way of power of Catholic leaders. So that certainly is a way that that could be why you wouldn't want to do that. I would say back, what is lost in not hearing these stories?
I'll share what's is the reason Polycarp is discussed in my faith tradition is that Polycarp is said to have been faithful to being good all the way to the end, and he couldn't turn to evil after being good for 85 years. So it's like it's a message to Christians to stay being good no matter what.
Oh, and where does that come in your tradition? I mean, why do you need to have that kind of meaning in your tradition?
It's just to make a difference between false martyrdom and true martyrdom, that you could go through rituals and be insincere, but the only real sincerity is to be faithful like Polycarp to the end. You can't turn from good to bad just because someone asks you to worship another god. You just, he says, I can't do that. I can't turn.
Oh, thank you very much, because that's totally new to me. And notice that your tradition really needs that kind of story.
Yeah,
that's powerful.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
I wonder about these stories, including a little more magic, like resisting the death means. Could that be embedded in Polycarp's culture? Is Smyrna part of modern day Turkey? And did they have more magic beliefs in their mythologies than some places further west?
I don't know Smyrna well enough, Mark, to give you an answer on that. I think I would want to say more generally, among the Christ people of the first 2 centuries, all around, there's a sense that things are possible that are amazing and that they come from God. Not because it's just crazy good, but because people are frightened and challenged. and they need a lot of help. And that instead of being afraid, they seem to tell stories about amazingly good things that happen. And I would say that means to a certain, well, even as we were doing last month with the meals of the early Christ people, it looks like the things they did were tell stories about goodness. I mean, the word, for instance, Eucharist means thanksgiving. And that doesn't mean like religious thanksgiving. That means being thankful that good things can happen. So yeah, I think I would want to say it's no. I want to say your question is really good. I wish I knew more about Smyrna, because I do know that when I know about certain places, I know that that there are places which are more alive with goodness and joy than others. And so I failed you in terms of Smyrna on that, in that regard. So other questions that need to be asked here, or do some of you, I'm pushing, why would you want to tell this story? Another question is, why wouldn't you want to tell the story? Is there something about this for some of you that says this is the wrong way to build build good stories and good Thanksgiving?
Well, you know, we did hear. I hear from some people who are usually with us to tell me whether they're going to come or not come. And one of our regular participants said, "I'm not sure I want to come to this one because I don't like the blood and gore. It just doesn't seem like it's useful. It's not very inspiring." So I think she would have said, "I don't want to hear this story."
Oh, well, then I need to apologize to you, Shirley, because I knocked out a customer of ours. But no, that's fascinating. So let's pretend that person is here this evening. And my answer there would be, man, I get that.
Yeah.
That is, who wants to have a lot of blood and gore in their life?
When you're trying to get inspired.
Well, and I think the answer, of course, is kind of obvious in the way I have treated this set of traditions, and that is because Rome was so violent. In other words, the reason you need to tell stories about blood and gore is because you see them every day. And they affect how you feel about life, and they affect how much it matters for you to have a sense of presence with you in difficult times. I learned this most thoroughly, and I've said this in a number of our sessions. So I was a pastor for 13 years in an extremely impoverished situation, that in which one of the main things that happened to my young people in my church, especially my young men, was the police would pick them up and beat them and throw them in jail. I mean, so for me to live in a community where daily life is in danger from one another and from the people who are in charge, one has to think clearly about how to be alive in that situation. So I would say to our friend that we missed tonight, yeah, I don't want to tell blood and gore stories gratuitously. But one would have to ask the question, even in our world, is there a lot of violence going on? Is there a lot of violence going on from people of power? And that I think is probably the reason that the 2nd century is so full of, I gotta think this through about what do we do about the violence that keeps coming at us.
And it's true, isn't it, that there was a lot of disagreement about that among those early writers, was that some people said you should do it and some people said you shouldn't do it, and they didn't agree on what to do.
Yeah, and I have to say, I think, for instance, of many of my the people I was with when I pastored in West Philly, and so I remember sitting in many more families in which the young men were facing so much hurt and loss and pain that even though I myself was not, this was during the Vietnam War, I wasn't interested in anybody going into the Army. But I, with parents, we decided that the best thing to do, the safest place to be, would be in the Army while the country is at war. So that would be, for instance, the way I know what you're saying, Shirley. When one faces pain and loss and violence, it's almost always hard choices that need to be made. And there I would want to say, and hardly for one to have an imagination that when you're facing death, like Polycarp is, you invite the people to dinner. That's a whole other way of thinking about living.
I don't want to carry this conversation too much with me. Oh, Helen, go ahead. You say something.
Just a really quick comment that, Christianity does have its cross. You can't separate it from the crown. And, someone saying, I don't want to be exposed to the blood and gore of this topic. Well, the cross is so central to our Christian. To ignore that, or to just, or to make it a second tier kind of event to the resurrection, I think is not the message of our Gospels.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and for instance, when we studied the Gospel of Mark last year together, what we noticed is that there is a broken body on every page. In other words, this set of texts seems to be full of joy, but it also seems to be full of crisis all the time. So Helen, thank you for reminding us that. So Paul, for instance, says that's why he has to always keep talking about Christ and about crucifixion.
And I think after the time of the martyrdom, when that was sort of finished in our history, a lot of people turned to monasticism and the Desert Fathers. And that was another kind of self-sacrifice that was available for people. So there seems to be a need within the whole tradition as a whole to be a part of something that's meaningful, but that is a form of sacrifice. And all the way back to the story of Jesus.
Thank you. So Shirley, if you don't mind, I will close with the fact that next month in June, we're not going to, although we could go more with Polycarp, we're going to be studying one of the Nag Hammadi documents that's least known, but I think has one of the most powerful stories. And that's the letter of Peter to Philip, in which the main things that happens is that the so-called apostles, they come together to have a plan about what to do with Roman violence. And what's happening to these apostles in that story is they know that because Jesus was killed, they are in danger of being killed. So the big question in the letter of Peter to Philip is, how do we deal with Roman violence? So Shirley and I have been doing a lot of work on this, and so we're going to be happy to work together on that on June 28th.
Well, and we should say, Hal, that we are working on a full course on this on our Udemy platform too. So we're hoping to get that done pretty soon. But next month, come to the discussion about it. That'd be fun. All right, well, then we will close it up. And I just want to thank everybody for your participation. And Hal, thank you so much for giving us more things to think about. I'm sure you're going to keep us thinking all the way till next month. Was the May 2021 Bible and Beyond Monday Textual Studies discussion on the life of Polycarp's death, led by Dr. Hal Taussig. Once a month at 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the fourth Monday of the month, we provide a discussion of one of the early Christian texts. Dr. Hal Taussig leads these sessions, sharing a well-framed overview of the particular text, allowing participants time to ask questions and share their insights. Donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives are greatly appreciated. To donate, simply go to our website at earlychristiantexts.com. You'll be able to donate either by PayPal or by check, or use the link that I've left on the chat room. We sincerely thank you for your support, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks so much.